It began on a Tuesday morning. At 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time, a statement quietly appeared on the public affairs page of the Department of Defense. There were no dramatic press conferences, no flashing cameras, no dramatic music, just words on a government webpage, formatted in the precise and careful language that senior military officials have spent careers learning to deploy. But those words landed like a detonation. Within 40 minutes, the statement had been screenshotted, cross-posted, and dissected on every major financial terminal and geopolitical intelligence desk from Washington to Brussels to Singapore. By noon, the currency markets had moved. By evening, every major television network had legal analysts, former generals, and constitutional scholars on camera, all trying to explain the same thing. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did it mean? To understand why this moment matters, we need to slow down. We need to peel back the institutional layers, read the signal beneath the noise, and understand something that most political commentary gets fundamentally wrong about American military power and its relationship to civilian government. Because this story is not simply about one statement from one group of officers. This story is about the architecture of American authority, who holds it, how it transfers, and what happens when that architecture develops a visible fracture. And fractures in geopolitics and in economics have consequences. Let's establish the context precisely. The United States military operates under a doctrine called civilian supremacy. It is not just a tradition. It is codified in the Constitution, in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and in decades of precedent that defines the relationship between the elected commander-in-chief and the uniformed chains of command beneath that office. For most of American history, this relationship has functioned with remarkable stability. Even through periods of intense political division, through Watergate, through the Civil Rights era, through the turbulence of Vietnam, the institutional posture of senior military leadership towards civilian authority remained formally intact. That history is what makes what happened on that Tuesday morning so significant. When a group of senior military figures, including retired officers with active institutional credibility and, according to sources familiar with the discussions, current officials communicating through formal channels, issued a statement declining to affirm their confidence in the current direction of civilian command authority, they were not speaking in the language of partisanship. They were speaking in the language of institutions. And institutions, as any serious student of geopolitics understands, speak very carefully. Every word is deliberate. Every phrase is weighted. The statement did not accuse. It did not threaten. It did not appeal to the public in dramatic terms. What it did, and this is the thing that the currency traders and the bond markets understood within the hour, was withdraw its confidence. In the grammar of institutional power, that withdrawal is not a small thing. At 3:22 p.m. Greenwich, meantime on the same day, the British pound moved. A small shift, almost imperceptible unless you were watching the 5-minute chart. But it moved in a direction that currency analysts would later describe as a safe harbor rotation. Capital, in moments of American institutional uncertainty, tends to hedge, not dramatically, not in panic, but in the quiet, systematic way that large institutional investors manage risk. By 4 p.m. Eastern, the yield on the 2-year Treasury note had nudged upward by 7 basis points. Again, not a dramatic movement by itself, but Treasury yields rising in response to a domestic political event is a signal. It means that someone somewhere with significant capital is pricing in a slightly higher risk premium for American government stability. Market reactions suggest something that political commentary often misses. The financial world does not wait for certainty. It trades on probability. And when the probability distribution of American institutional stability shifts, even slightly, the markets move in that direction immediately and without sentiment. This is important for American viewers to understand because what happens in that bond market does not stay in that bond market. It flows outward into mortgage rates, into corporate borrowing costs, into the inflation calculus that every working American feels at the grocery store and the gas pump. We will return to those consequences in detail. But first, we need to understand the chronological architecture of how this situation evolved over the critical 72 hours that followed the initial statement. In the first 24 hours, the White House response was carefully calibrated. According to public statements released through the press office, the administration characterized the military communication as the opinion of a small group of individuals who did not represent the broad posture of the armed forces. This is a standard deflection strategy. Reduce the signal by questioning its source. Diminish the speaker to diminish the message. But within hours, something unusual happened. A second group of officers, this time including individuals still actively serving in advisory capacities, issued what a senior defense policy analyst described as a corroborating non-denial. They did not add their names to the original statement, but when asked directly by reporters whether they endorsed the position of their civilian leadership, their responses were, in the precise clinical language of institutional communication, non-committal. In military culture, non-commitment is not neutral. Non-commitment, when it comes from individuals whose entire professional identity is built around clarity of command and affirmation of authority, is itself a statement. The strategic logic becomes clearer when we examine what this kind of signal does inside the institution itself. Career military officers watch their superiors carefully. They take cues not just from what senior leaders say, but from what they conspicuously fail to say. When senior officers decline to affirm, junior officers notice. And junior officers, in time, become senior officers. The institutional culture of the American military, its willingness to execute civilian direction without question, does not get preserved through speeches. It gets preserved through daily reinforcement of the norm. When that reinforcement stops, even briefly, the effect propagates. By hour 36, the situation had attracted international attention of a qualitatively different kind. NATO-allied defense ministers had begun receiving briefings. According to public statements from the German Foreign Ministry and the French defense apparatus, senior European officials requested what diplomatic language calls clarifying consultations, meaning they wanted to know directly whether American command authority could be relied upon in a crisis scenario. This is not a hypothetical concern for America's European allies. NATO's entire security architecture rests on the assumption that American military commitments are backed by a unified chain of command, one in which civilian decisions are executed by military professionals without delay or internal resistance. If that chain develops visible fractures, every security calculation in Europe changes. Historical patterns indicate how seriously this kind of uncertainty is taken. In 1974, as the Watergate crisis reached its peak and questions about Nixon's psychological stability began circulating in defense circles, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger reportedly issued informal guidance that any nuclear command orders should be cleared through him before execution. That guidance was never formally acknowledged. It has never been fully confirmed. But the fact that it was reportedly issued tells us everything about how the American national security establishment responds to perceived command instability. The response, historically, is to quietly build redundancy into the chain, to create informal checkpoints, to ensure that no single individual's instability can trigger catastrophic action. And that historical precedent is precisely what the international observer community had in mind when they heard about the Tuesday statement. At hour 48, the economic dimension of the story became impossible to ignore. The dollar index, which measures the value of the US dollar against a basket of major currencies, had declined by 0.4% since the statement's release. Again, not catastrophic in isolation, but 0.4% on the dollar index, sustained over a 48-hour period without a corresponding economic trigger like inflation data or a Fed announcement, tells an experienced currency analyst something specific. It tells them that the market's confidence in American institutional predictability has taken a measurable, quantifiable hit. For American viewers, a weakening dollar has direct and immediate consequences. Energy prices, oil, natural gas, the inputs that power American manufacturing and heat American homes, are denominated in dollars. When the dollar weakens, those prices rise in dollar terms. Not because the underlying commodity became more expensive, but because the currency in which it's priced became less valuable. This is the invisible tax of geopolitical instability. It doesn't show up as a line item on any budget. It doesn't require a vote in Congress. It simply appears in the gradual creep of prices, in the quiet erosion of purchasing power, in the slight but consistent pressure on household budgets that economists call inflationary drift. Supply chains are similarly sensitive. American corporations that source materials globally hedge their currency exposure, but hedging has costs. When currency volatility increases, those hedging costs rise. Those costs get passed to consumers. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently. And consistently over time means structurally. The jobs picture is more complex, but no less real. Defense contractors, companies that employ hundreds of thousands of American workers across dozens of states, operate on long-term contracts that assume stable civilian-military relationships. When that stability comes into question, procurement decisions get delayed. Contracts get reviewed. Investment timelines get pushed back. None of this produces a dramatic jobs report, but it produces the kind of slow-moving economic friction that erodes regional economies and hollows out manufacturing communities over years, not months. To understand why this matters at the household level, consider that the American defense industrial base is not concentrated on the coasts. It runs through the heartland, through Alabama and Ohio and Texas and Connecticut and California's Central Valley. When Washington's institutional confidence wobbles, that wobble travels along the supply chain. Hour 72 brought what analysts would later identify as the most significant development of the entire episode. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the nation's highest-ranking military officer, had been silent since the initial statement. His silence, in itself, had been interpreted in competing ways. Some saw it as institutional loyalty, waiting for the appropriate moment to affirm command authority. Others saw it as something more ambiguous. At 11:15 a.m. Eastern on the third day, he appeared before cameras in a brief, unscheduled availability with reporters in the Pentagon briefing room. His statement was 11 sentences long. It affirmed, in general terms, the importance of civilian oversight of the military. It used the phrase constitutional chain of command 4 times in 11 sentences, and it conspicuously, in the opinion of every senior defense analyst who reviewed it that day, declined to personally endorse the specific policy decisions of the current administration's civilian leadership. That's when the real strategy became visible. What had emerged over 72 hours was not a coup, not a rebellion, not a dramatic confrontation. It was something more subtle and, in many ways, more significant. It was the American military's senior institutional layer engaging in what political psychologists call structured distancing, maintaining formal compliance with civilian authority while withdrawing the effective endorsement that gives civilian authority its full operational weight. The psychological dimension of this development deserves careful attention because leadership psychology is not a soft supplement to geopolitical analysis. It is the mechanism through which strategy gets executed or fails. President Trump's leadership style has been documented, analyzed, and debated extensively across his political career. What is relevant here is not his personality, but the institutional response to it. Military professionals, by training and temperament, prize predictability above almost all other leadership qualities. They can work with difficult personalities. They can navigate political pressures. What they struggle with, what the institutional culture is structurally ill-equipped to absorb, is unpredictability in the command environment. When a commander-in-chief's decisions are perceived internally as driven by factors other than strategic coherence, when officers find themselves unable to anticipate the policy environment they're being asked to operate in, the institutional response is to build protective distance. Not defiance. Distance. That distance has costs. In a high-tempo operational environment, a crisis in the Pacific, a rapid escalation in the Middle East, a sudden demand for force deployment, the difference between a military that is fully, effectively aligned with its civilian leadership and one that is operating at institutional arm's length can be measured in hours. And in geopolitical crises, hours matter. America's adversaries understand this. They study it. China's People's Liberation Army analytical community has, according to open-source academic publications, extensively modeled scenarios in which American civil-military cohesion is degraded. Russia's strategic planning, as reflected in their public military doctrine, explicitly identifies Western institutional fragmentation as a force multiplier for adversarial operations. The practical implication is sobering. When American institutions fracture publicly, adversaries become more willing to test boundaries. They probe. They make moves in gray zones, in disputed waters, in information environments, in economic pressure campaigns that they would not make if they assessed American command authority as fully coherent and unified. And those probes have economic consequences. They drive up insurance costs for international shipping. They create uncertainty premiums in energy markets. They push allied governments to accelerate their own independent defense spending, redirecting resources that might otherwise flow toward trade and investment. Historical parallels are illuminating here, though history never repeats with perfect fidelity. In the early 1970s, the combination of Watergate's institutional trauma and the visible fractures between the Nixon White House and the intelligence community created a period of profound American strategic ambiguity. Allies in East Asia, uncertain about the reliability of American commitments, began quiet conversations about alternative security architectures. The Soviet Union, reading the same signals, escalated its pressure operations in the Middle East, contributing to the conditions that produced the 1973 oil embargo and the stagflation crisis that defined the decade. In the late 1990s, a different kind of civil-military tension focused on the Clinton administration's relationship with the Joint Chiefs during the Kosovo deliberations, produced slower, more tentative military planning than the operational situation demanded. The delay did not produce catastrophe, but it did produce a longer conflict and higher humanitarian costs than analysts believed were necessary given the available military options. The lesson from both episodes is not that civil-military friction is invariably catastrophic. It is that it degrades efficiency, introduces uncertainty into both allied and adversarial calculations, and imposes economic costs that are real even when they are diffuse. Now let us turn to the scenarios, not predictions. Scenarios grounded in realistic policy trajectories, informed by historical pattern, and calibrated to the actual range of plausible outcomes. In the first scenario, the administration moves quickly to restore institutional confidence through a combination of personnel decisions, policy clarifications, and high-level reassurances to NATO allies. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs makes a clear, unambiguous public statement of confidence. The dollar recovers. Bond markets stabilize. The episode is remembered as a significant but ultimately contained moment of institutional stress. In this scenario, the economic consequences are limited: a short-term inflation bump in energy prices, modest friction in defense procurement, and some temporary hedging costs in currency markets. The American institutional architecture absorbs the stress and demonstrates its resilience. This scenario requires, above all, that the administration recognizes the signal the military is sending and responds to the substance, not just the optics. In the second scenario, the tension persists without resolution. The military maintains its structured distance. Allies continue their quiet contingency planning. Adversaries continue their probing. The dollar remains under modest but persistent pressure. Inflation, already sensitive to energy prices and supply chain costs, absorbs an additional 0.3 to 0.5 percentage point of upward pressure, enough to delay any Fed easing cycle and maintain higher borrowing costs for American families and businesses. Defense procurement slows. Job creation in the industrial base softens. The American economy does not enter recession, but it moves closer to the fragile equilibrium that economists describe as stagnant with downside risk. This scenario does not require a dramatic confrontation. It only requires that the current ambiguity continues without clear resolution. In the third scenario, the one that markets are most anxious about and that no serious analyst believes is inevitable, but none are willing to dismiss, the tension escalates. A geopolitical crisis emerges in a region where American military commitment is being tested. Taiwan Strait, Persian Gulf, Baltic Sea. The details matter less than the dynamic. A moment arrives where an adversary makes a significant move, betting that American civil-military cohesion is insufficient to produce a rapid, coherent response. If that bet is right, even partially, the consequences are severe. Energy markets spike. The dollar experiences a sharp safe harbor rotation that paradoxically strengthens the yen and the Swiss franc while pressuring emerging market currencies. Global supply chains, already fragile from years of geopolitical restructuring, seize up again. American inflation surges. The Fed faces the impossible choice between fighting inflation and supporting economic growth. Jobs are lost, not in weeks, but in a steady contraction that follows sustained uncertainty. And the American-led global order, the architecture of alliances, institutions, and norms that has underwritten prosperity for 80 years, enters a period of genuine structural review. This third scenario is not probable, but its very existence in the distribution of outcomes is itself a cost. Because sophisticated actors, central banks, multinational corporations, sovereign wealth funds do not wait for bad outcomes to materialize before they price in the risk. They price it continuously. And that continuous risk pricing is the invisible tax on American institutional instability that never appears in any headline but flows through every economic system that touches the dollar. Which brings us to the question that this channel always returns to: what does this mean for you? Not abstractly, not theoretically, for you. If you have a mortgage, the interest rate environment is partly a function of Treasury yield stability, which is partly a function of confidence in American institutions. If you run a small business that relies on imported materials or exports finished goods, the dollar's value is your operating environment. If you work in defense manufacturing, in aerospace, in advanced technology sectors with government contracts, the health of civil-military relationships is directly connected to your employment security. And if you simply go to the grocery store, fill your gas tank, or pay your utility bills, you live every day with the downstream economic consequences of what happens in the institutional corridors of American power. This is not meant to alarm you. It is meant to do what serious geopolitical analysis should always do: connect the large structures of power to the lived realities of ordinary people so that those realities make sense, and so that citizens can engage with the systems that shape their lives from a position of knowledge rather than confusion. The story of the Tuesday statement is not over. It is still unfolding. Institutions rarely resolve their tensions quickly. The American military, like all large institutions, has an enormous capacity to absorb internal stress while maintaining its external posture. The officers who sign that statement or quietly aligned with it are not revolutionaries. They are, by every account, deeply committed to the constitutional principles that define their service. But commitment to constitutional principles, in a moment when those principles feel under stress, sometimes looks like friction with civilian authority. And that friction, even when it comes from the right instinct, has consequences that extend far beyond the institutional relationships that generated it. What we are watching in real time is something that has no clean historical precedent and no easy resolution. We are watching the most powerful military institution in human history navigate a moment of genuine civil-military ambiguity in a world where adversaries are watching closely, allies are recalibrating quietly, and markets are pricing every signal with ruthless precision. The outcome is not determined. The scenarios are real. And the choices made in the coming weeks by the administration, by military leadership, by Congress, and ultimately by the American public that both institutions serve, will shape the economic and strategic environment for years to come. That is the nature of geopolitical inflection points. They rarely announce themselves with drama. They appear, first, as a statement on a government webpage, a movement in a currency chart, a non-committal answer at a Pentagon briefing, and then, gradually, the full weight of what has shifted becomes visible. That's what we're here to do, to see clearly, analyze carefully, and think seriously about the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most likely outcome of this civil-military tension? Do you see historical parallels I haven't mentioned? Do you think the markets are overreacting or not reacting enough? The comments are where the real analysis happens on this channel, And this community consistently produces some of the most sophisticated discussion anywhere on the internet. If this kind of deep, calm, evidence-based geopolitical analysis is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because the situation we analyze today is going to keep developing, and we are going to keep covering it with the same rigor, the same analytical neutrality, and the same commitment to helping you understand the world you actually live in. Stay informed. Stay thoughtful. We'll see you in the next one.